This is the DRS train.
Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is 2008 without Hamilton, Massa and Raikkonen. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Nav F1 and returning guest Nedzo's F1 Gridbox. Welcome, guys.
Hi, Peter. 2008 was my first season in F1, and I have very fond memories of it, so let's get into it.
Yeah, 2008 wasn't my first season. I wasn't in F1 by this point. I would have been 4 years old, but yeah, let's get into it.
So this is the third and final part of our three-part series covering 2008. So in the first two episodes, we covered Massa's title challenge and his lawsuits against the results of the Singapore Grand Prix. In the second part, we covered the Santander saga and sort of espionage scandal that was going on with Raikkonen. So this time, in a similar fashion to when we did 1976 without their iconic title fight of Hunt and Lauda, we're now going to do the same for 2008. So we can talk about everything except Hamilton, Massa and Raikkonen. And on that note, I think a good place to start is Heikki Kovalainen, Hamilton's teammate. So his first year, 2007 Renault, fairly good season for a rookie. He was replacing Alonso. Towards the end of the year, he gets his first podium and then ends up largely outperforming Fisichella. And then he takes over from Alonso again in 2008 when he goes back to Mercedes and back to McLaren Mercedes, and gets that seat as Hamilton's number two, but not really a brilliant performance from him, particularly as a number two, because he essentially cost the team the Constructors' Championship.
I completely agree. I mean, he came off the back, as you said, of 2007, beating Fisichella, who was known as the midfield stalwart, kind of the Sergio Perez of his day. Very good in midfield machinery, but often floundered in top cars. I mean, in 2008, he did what Fisichella did, which was flounder in a top car. He got a couple of podiums. By a couple, I literally mean actually 3 podiums. One of which was his win in Hungary, which came as a result of Massa retiring late on. But yeah, I mean, the main thing I remember about Kovalainen's season was that win, obviously, and the thing I remember from that was James Allen saying, "This is the first of many for Heikki Kovalainen," and then it never was. So that's not a very good season from Kovalainen there.
Yeah, Kovalainen, he was a weird one in 2008 because even that swap deal with Alonso was just weird. I mean, we all know why it happened, but it was a bit unexpected. A lot of people were wondering why McLaren chose Kovalainen, and I really think it was just a matter of simplicity, because Alonso wanted to go back to Renault, and Renault was like, "Yeah, let's just send our rookie there instead." Kovalainen had a really good junior career leading up to 2007, so I think from what I remember, there was quite some hype to see how good Kovalainen would stack up against Lewis, and then obviously you finish 7th in the standings with 3 podiums when your teammate wins the title. That's not very good, and he didn't start badly. He finished 5th in Melbourne, and that should have been second, and he had the fastest lap of the race. That's an extremely good debut, and I think that was why there was a lot of hype, at least in March, both in terms of before his start and then the actual race. But then there was a mix of bad luck, and then McLaren realizing, look, there's no worth in helping Kovalainen a lot, because Kovalainen's not going to be fighting in P3, P4, being able to snatch points from Kimi or Felipe. So they just kind of left him behind. And you just wonder, why wouldn't you really do that? They had this British driver, British phenomenon, who was clearly in the title. Yeah, it's a bit sad when you think about it, but that's what happens when you go so quickly into a title contender of a team.
I memean, maybe they thought that because of how things had gone in 2007, maybe it's best if our drivers are not so close on track, and we can just leave it. And hopefully, if Hamilton gets ahead enough, then maybe Kovalainen can still do enough to get that constructors title. But if you take it that he should be finishing fourth as a minimum in each race, he only met those expectations 5 times across a season with 16 races. Though, I mean, he was still mostly getting points finishes, but there were a few races, Turkey, Singapore, where he was outside the points. There were a couple of retirements, although I don't think any of those were his fault. Because, I mean, Spain, tyre blowout, goes off into the barriers and he's on a stretcher. He got crash damage at the start of Japan. I can't remember with China. So he ended up having more kind of reliability problems than Lewis as well, which didn't help.
And the other thing with Kovalainen that season is he's not remembered as much for his win, I would say, than for his pole position in Silverstone, where a lot of people thought he would just give away to Lewis at the start, so Lewis could, become a hero on home soil. Obviously, Lewis did that anyway and won by, I think, a minute. I think it was 66 seconds, which is absolutely insane. But for the first, I think, was it the first 10 laps? Kovalainen was fighting really hard. And I think that was probably his highlight of the season, because he showed that if he had the opportunity, he wouldn't hesitate to bring the fight to Lewis. But again, that was a summary of his season, not just because of that, but because after those 10 laps, he was nowhere. He just fell back, while Lewis had one of the most genuinely legendary drives of modern-ish days, if we consider modern to be the last 20 years of Formula One. So yeah, McLaren, very good season. Kovalainen, not really.
Yeah, I mean, he got the win, but he only got it because, well, Massa retired from the lead, and then Hamilton had a puncture which had dropped him down to 5th. So that's something that he otherwise shouldn't have really won. But he was still in a reasonably good position. Is that without that, he could have got a podium. But even, 2009 was even worse because the car was even worse. But then when he did go to Lotus and Caterham, he was actually very good there. But that gets overlooked because it was in a very anonymous car and no points were scored. So there was obviously talent there, but he just felt kind of like a bit of a proto Bottas in one sense, with Bottas maybe being closer on pace to Lewis, but just not having the fight in him, whereas Kovalainen did at least attempt to fight with him on the rare occasions he could keep up with him.
One thing that really gets forgotten in a race that really gets remembered is that in the 2008 Italian Grand Prix where Vettel wins, Kovalainen is starting second. He was the favorite by every single fan and journalist and team principal probably to win that race. I don't think that, I don't remember anyone really bigging up Vettel to win the race unless something would happen to Kovalainen. And he apparently had some brake heating issues, but still he was up against a Toro Rosso, which, we know they were extremely good at that race. But that should have been an easy win. So, we're not going to go into 2009, where he also got a bit slaughtered by Lewis, but I just don't think it was the right move for his career at that point. He was a good driver, and I think he could have enjoyed a Magnussen-like career in Formula One if he hadn't just been thrusted as Lewis's teammate so early into his career.
Another point from the 2008 Italian Grand Prix, which you might not have known, was at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the case because there might have been another one since, but I think that was the youngest podium in F1 history in terms of average age of the drivers, because you had not just Vettel, who was 21 years and 73 days, I think it was. You had Kovalainen, who was in his early 20s, and Robert Kubica, and they were all very young collectively.
Yeah, I mean, that race in general was just very unusual. Obviously, for me, it was very surreal because I was a diehard Vettel fan. Because the front runners that we're obviously not talking about were all just completely faltered and were nowhere. And to have a Toro Rosso that was suddenly so competitive. And it did seem like it could be Kovalainen's chance. But the thing is, the only time he got within sight of Vettel was when Vettel pitted. And then Kovalainen pitted the next lap and was just behind him. And it's like, oh, he's caught up. And it's like, oh, no, he hasn't pitted yet. And Vettel won that race by 12 seconds, when really it should have been one in a McLaren. But it just wasn't. It wasn't to be. It could have been worse. I mean, I don't think it was maybe as bad as, say, Gasly at Red Bull, or Albon, but it was just the lack of consistency and just not rarely even putting himself in a position to be a good number two, which meant that a lot of the time Lewis was having to fight both Ferraris himself, even if Raikkonen was having to fight with one arm behind his back.
Yeah, for me, it just completely ruined his potential F1 career. That might just be me. And the issue was that he was not fighting with the teams he should have been fighting with, such as BMW Sauber, who enjoyed their best season ever. Well, if you consider Sauber as an outfit, that was their best season ever. Their only win came in that season, and Kubica just really shone through the first half of the season. I think most people will remember that after the Canadian Grand Prix, which he wins, Kubica is leading the championship. And sadly, we would not see that again because BMW, again, famous story, they choose to focus on the 2009 efforts just after, I don't know if it was just after that race or a few weeks later. And we know how that went.
Yeah, I mean, this was obviously a really good year for them, 2008. I mean, they built a really, really beautiful car as well with that great BMW livery. This one, they had probably... This year was known for having extremely elaborate aerodynamic appendages on every car. And they kind of took this to a new level because they had the sort of ram horns on the nose cone, and then they had those like horn things on the engine cover as well. And there was a lot going on their car. And it meant that, it was only marginally slower than Ferrari and McLaren. Where it really shone was actually supreme reliability because it never broke down in the entire season, which even then was extremely rare. That was almost unheard of to have no breakdowns in a season. But it was that lack of development that just mean he led the championship for 2 races basically, and then dropped. Then he went from finishing top 4 in the first like 6 or 7 races, and then he started drifting to like 6th, 7th, 8th. And then we had Singapore and then Brazil where he finished outside the points. So it drifted back. Whereas Heidfeld in the second one, he finished second 4 times. He famously is tied with Lando Norris for most podiums without a win on 13. But he had lots more races where he finished outside the point. So he was just generally a lot more inconsistent, even though against a younger and far less experienced driver. And Kubica was one of the real stars of the future at the time.
I think
Kubica was seen by many at the time as the best driver of the 2008 season, which is incredible when you realize he finished 4th in the championship. Anytime you see a driver be praised as driver of the season when he was outside the top 2, top 3, means it was incredible, and it really was. There was a lot about how the BMW really suited his style of driving, very aggressive, and also his style as a person. BMW wasn't really, at least that team wasn't really about faff or just making waves, which you could have expected because BMW was known in other kinds of motorsport for being this really likable, kind of cool-ish team. But their team was, in 2008, it started with them just wanting to win, wanting to be fast. And then it just became so weird in terms of, politics. I think in 2009, we will have a better chance. They wouldn't. And why would you not bank on your current car that actually is leading the championship? Kubica as well, he felt frustrated, I think, with BMW when he realized that he wouldn't be able to keep up. Because in the first, I think from the second to the seventh race, the second to the 7th race of the season, he finished in the top 4 every single time. And then you just see the drop-off suddenly. And he would still be getting podiums in that BMW, even when they stopped developing it. So it was clear at that time, I think, that Kubica would be a future world champion. And obviously it didn't happen.
Yeah, because I think on pure pace, the car wasn't really fast enough. I mean, he was being helped by the fact that McLaren and Ferrari were just paragons of inconsistency. Because all 3 of those drivers, they'd each had a retirement or an out of the points finish by Canada. I mean, Kubica had himself because Australia was a crazy race, and I think he collided with Kazuki Nakajima. because one of the main things about 2008 was that they got rid of traction control and engine braking, and I think that was quite a big adjustment for a lot of the drivers because they'd had traction control since 2001 when it was legalized again, and so that meant it took a few races for people to get into it. But yeah, it was poor management decision because again, I really love to know I know that the 2009 car, that I think they were a bit blindsided by Braun, Toyota, and Williams because they didn't have a double diffuser, and they put one on eventually, and the car got better, but just wasn't very good. And it's like you've spent all this time developing a car that's awful when Honda did exactly the same thing and it won the championship. So clearly, some kind of mismanagement going on there, or just getting the wrong end of the stick with the regs. When he could have made through sheer consistency, maybe could have been a dark horse for the title in 2008.
He could have been
one of the reasons Kubica gets credited so much is that he's seen as the one who didn't make mistakes. As you said, he was consistent in 2008. Peter, would you agree that, especially compared to Lewis and Massa, who made loads of mistakes, Kubica really shown as someone who could keep out of trouble? Canada was the best example, obviously, because everyone was just being extremely stupid, and Kubica just did the opposite.
I mean, my driver of the season is Vettel, but Kubica, yeah, maybe it was just a cool head, but maybe less pressure because he wasn't seen as a title contender, and that the other three were making so many more errors. I mean, 2008 is Canada is a good example because, of course, that's where Hamilton and Raikkonen crashed in the pit lane, and Hamilton hit Raikkonen because he went to the left. Kubica was alongside him; he went to the right, and he was able to carry on because he didn't hit any of them, and that's how he won the race. And obviously, if he'd gone to the left, it could have been a very different story. Yeah, it was just aside from a couple of retirements that were caused by spinning off or accidents, it was basically a flawless season from him.
It does remind me of Frentzen in '99, you could say, in his Jordan, when he challenged Ish for the title, was again consistent when the leading two either weren't consistent or broke their legs or were just terrible in the second Ferrari. Yeah, or you could even say it's kind of like a Olivier Panis in 1997 if he didn't break his legs. Obviously, Kubica didn't break his legs, but it's BMW basically broke his legs by not updating the car.
And in this case, if Nick Heidfeld was Jacques Villeneuve and he scored 2 points all year, it would be very similar to 99. And Jordan, I think, yeah.
Well, quickly, Heidfeld, what did you think about his season, Peter? Because I remember him as just being a bit forgettable, not because of not scoring points, because he was, but he got so outshone by Kubica, and in the end, just about got beaten by Alonso in the standings as well, which we will touch upon soon. So he didn't even make the top 5 in the end of the standings.
Yeah, I mean, this was my first full season of F1, so I was very new to it. I knew that he seemed to be one of the bigger names, I guess, and he'd been around for a reasonably long time. But it was just a lot of inconsistency to get 4 second places, but no wins or podiums, and he finished every race, but he finished outside of the points 6-7 times, actually. I mean, we had, Monaco 14th, he was 13th in France, 10th in Hungary. These are really not good results when these are all races that Kubica did much better at. But the year before, I think in 2007, I think he'd outscored Kubica because that year they had the third fastest car, and they got 2 podiums that year, and both of them came from him. Again, really, really consistently scoring points. They ended up getting second in the constructors because of Spygate. But yeah, I think Kubica now was kind of coming into his own because again he joined halfway through 2006, and Heidfeld had been on the grid since 2000 at that point.
I mean, it's incredible that Heidfeld, he finished second 4 times in the season, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's not a single one of them where he was actually close to winning. So it was always second, but fairly second. It wasn't a close call or something that he really messed up with. And the main issue was that in qualifying, he got beaten 13-5 by Kubica, even though in race pace he was quite similar. to his teammate. I think he even got fastest lap 2 or 3 times, and he was in the top 3 fastest laps 7 or 8 times. So he had the pace during the race, but he just apparently couldn't get the tires heated up at all, and the car just didn't suit him. In the end, he only finished 15 points behind Kubica, it must be said. But the fact he couldn't get a win that season showed why he is the driver with the most podiums without a win still now.
It is a contrast because I was just looking at the 2007 season because I remember reading, I think it was the ITV's F1 guide to 2007, and Heidfeld was, I think there were multiple features on him doing really well at the start of the season, and I think he nearly doubled Kubica's points tally in 07. And then he comes into 2008. Obviously, Kubica gets another year of experience under his belt, and again, Kubica just beats him. It's an interesting situation that an experienced driver falls that foul of a newer driver.
Yeah, it meant that basically 2008, they'd started their downfall. They went from competing against Ferrari and McLaren in the first half of the season to then competing against Renault in the second half, who they themselves had an interesting kind of turn of events because they'd gone from two constructors titles, and then they lose Alonso in 07. The car just doesn't work for them, and they drift backwards. And then Alonso comes back. Things start not brilliantly because they've got him and they've got Nelson Piquet Jr. in the car, and then things start getting suspiciously good, I think, in the second half of the season. They're remembered for some pretty interesting things that went on.
Yeah, so that season is where I properly became an Alonso fan. I had already seen him, obviously, as a contender. I started watching 2007, and there were the 3 main contenders. And then in 2008, it would be very hard not to say, even with Crashgate, that Alonso wasn't one of the top 3 drivers of the season. He was incredible, especially after the summer break. So obviously Singapore, yes. But even if you remove Singapore, he was the driver with the most points after the summer break, tied with Kimi. So if you remove Singapore, I think they're both on 38 points, and then come Massa, Hamilton, and the others. The start of the season had him very frustrated because Renault was 1 second off the pace. He was still having very good drives. So the first race of the season from 11th to 4th, really good moves on Kovalainen and Raikkonen. But you could still see that there was a lot of frustration of not being able to fight with the fastest cars. So in Monaco, for example, there's a really funny radio message, and you can find it on YouTube on I think it's the radio rewind of the 2008 Monaco Grand Prix. Alonso was when it started raining, Alonso was the fastest by quite a bit, I think half a second. And the radio message is, Fernando, keep it clean. You are the fastest and you are predicted to win on lap 10. And then he just sends it in the barrier, which is one of the few proper mistakes you can really single out in Alonso's career. He just went into the barrier for no reason. So there was a lot of frustration. And then obviously in the second half of the season, things improve.
Yeah, in my video I did last year where I basically took 2008 and ran the races in reverse order, Alonso was leading the championship up until Hungary, I think. So for quite a long time, and then it does just drop off dramatically. And obviously that was designed to sort of reframe about how you can win and lose a title. And in that video, you see how Massa fluffing it in the final 2 races in this version is like, well, maybe he just blew the title in the first 2 in real life. But yeah, Alonso, it was a difficult start, and obviously there was a kind of irony in the fact that it was Piquet that got a podium before him, because he got that one in Germany, which ended up being because of a very clever pitting during a safety car. It was kind of confusing how it works.
Later.
It was kind of confusing at the time because this is when we still had refueling. And so it wasn't necessarily always the obvious thing to pit in a safety car, and it made strategies a bit harder to understand. But they had these stupid rules, and we saw this in 2008 about closing the pit lane, which forced some people to pit so they didn't run out of fuel. But so he had this new teammate who wasn't expected to show him up, and to be honest, didn't, because he only scored points 4 times, and he got less than a third of Alonso's points. But yeah, obviously, Singapore notwithstanding, it was a very good end of the year for him.
Yeah, because if you look at the last 6 races, it's fourth, first, fourth, and second. And I absolutely love that 2008 Japanese Grand Prix, mostly because of Singapore. Because, well, we will have a Crash Gate episode later on, but Briatore wanted that to happen because there was a clause that said that if Alonso didn't win a race in 2008, he could leave. Famously, Braun was on his case. Red Bull was thinking of replacing Coulthard with not Coulthard. Yes, Coulthard with Coulthard or Webber.
Probably
No, yeah,
Coulthard
he
because he was
wanted
retiring at the
Alonso
end of the
for
season.
Webber. Yeah, they wanted Alonso for Webber in 2009, and Briatore saw that. He saw that there was a lot of shenanigans happening in other teams. It was a shit show. The silly season in 2008 was incredible, which is funny because in 2009 the only change we got was Buemi for
Buemi replacing Vettel and Vettel replacing Coulthard.
there. Yeah. So Briatore saw that, and that's why he had to make up that win in Singapore. And then in Japan, Alonso actually wins on pure pace against a very good Kubica who was chasing him down. So yeah, Renault had a weird season, and they had to deal with this champion who was happy to be back, but also a bit frustrated to not be, with the top dogs. And then you had Piquet Jr., who had a very good junior career, who was second to Lewis Hamilton in 2006 in GP2, his main competitor, but was just nowhere, really. Now, was it due to Alonso's politics and domination at Renault, or was it just due to Piquet not being fast? Who really knows?
Yeah, it was kind of, yeah, he had a lot going for him, Piquet, because obviously his dad was Nelson Piquet Sr., this 3-time champion. But then we've seen in a lot of cases, there have been a lot of father-son pairings in Formula One. It's very rare that the son actually outperforms the father. And this again is another example of that. And he, like 2009, things got worse, and then it was then that he got kicked out of the team for not being good enough, and that's when he obviously spills the tea about Singapore as his vengeance, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, obviously anyone is going to struggle against Alonso. I mean, we're seeing this with Stroll these days. I mean, Piquet probably struggled more, I'd say, but I think the car was definitely worse, even if Aston Martin haven't won any races yet.
On Piquet, I just saw when researching this episode, he qualified behind the Super Aguri for his debut. That's about as worse a debut you can ever wish to get.
Yeah, and then didn't even finish the race as well. I mean, it was, yeah, very chaotic race. I mean, I missed this one because Bahrain was the first race I actually started watching, and I was like, oh, I'll keep watching from here on. So I'd missed Australia and Malaysia live. I've watched them since then. But I just remember this one being the one that had only 7 drivers finished, and it had Massa crashed 3 times or something, and just really, really crazy race that kind of gets forgotten a bit these days. Particularly because we had another Australian race much more recently that had a lot of chaos in it.
It's just mad for me that Piquet, just before joining F1, he said that Hamilton was nothing special. When Lewis started doing well in 2007, he said Lewis is nothing special. I had the same pace in GP2, and obviously Lewis's debut in Melbourne was overtaking Alonso at the start, whereas Piquet's debut was getting out-qualified by a Super Aguri. So, yeah, strong expectations, didn't deliver, and he was out of the sport a few months later.
That covers a lot of drivers who had a lot of potential. I'm trying to think of other examples. Bruno Senna was another one. I mean, obviously the nephew of a 3-time champion. and everyone was like, "Oh my god, this guy's gonna be the next greatest thing," and then he wasn't. Obviously, PK did get the one anomalous result in Germany, and yeah, I just think he could have been a lot more. Whether it was because obviously he did do well in GP2, and you can't ignore those results. Like they were just, I don't know what the GP2 field was like in 2006. I know there were people like Adam Carroll who never made it to F1. I don't know if it was a particularly strong or a weak field. But yeah, the contrast between GP2 and F1, it can be a mix of factors. It could be just the mix of the weak field, or it could be just the fact that PK couldn't adapt to F1 cars. There are several drivers who have done that, like Ricardo Rossets and people like that.
I mean, looking at the GP2 field in 06, it's not bad. It could be stronger. I mean, there are a few future F1 drivers in there. I mean, we've got obviously Hamilton, PK, Timo Glock is in there. He won the title in 2007. Giorgio Pantano had done F1 already. Gianmaria Bruni, again, he did F1 before. Lucas de Grassi would come up a few years later. And then we had a Vitaly Petrov, and then there are a lot of like test drivers as well that have done that did a lot of testing but never made it to Formula One. So Alexander Premat, Ernesto Vizo, Jose Maria Lopez, Neil Jarni, Firut Sforzi. These are all drivers that did testing for a couple of years for teams. But yeah, it's not the best GP2 lineup, but also not the worst, I'd say.
I mean, given the names you've just said, I'd expect him to become. I'd expect a good enough driver to be coming second in that field, because I think the second best driver in that field, the next best driver behind Hamilton and Piquet would have probably been Glock at that point, because Pantano, although he'd done F1 before, he was I think it was like 4 races for Jordan in 2004, and I don't think he showed anything special. And Bruni did a full season with Benardi, and got his arse handed to him by Jolt Baumgartner. And Jean Baumgartner was a pay driver who wasn't really that good either.
Yeah. I mean, PK, he finished only 12 points behind Hamilton in GP2, but Hamilton, just sheer consistency. I mean, he hadn't won a race since Silverstone, which was the middle round. But then in the final, because obviously there were 2 races per round, in the final 10 races, he finished second 5 times and got 2 third places. And he'd won 5 races that year, whereas PK won 4. PK got more pole positions as well, but then he retired from one of them. And Hamilton actually got a disqualification in Imola too. So yeah, Hamilton, he was just much more consistent, because everyone else, there's a lot of retirements going on, and the drop off is quite sharp, because Alexandre Premat in third, he got 66 points to PK's 102. So it was really a 2-horse race between Hamilton and PK.
Another thing I've just realised is Giorgio Pantano finished 5th in that year's standings despite missing 3 of the 11 races. That kind of proves just how chaotic it was below the first 2.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in a tweet because I was looking at a while ago. I did a video on Fabio Lima, who won the GP2 title in 2013, and he never made it to Formula One. The extent of his Formula One experience was he did one FP1 outing with Manor in 2015. And obviously, people say that's one of the least competitive F1 grids, GP2 grids, and to be honest, it is. There's not much, but more guys ended up in Formula E than Formula One in that field. But one thing that was really interesting in that was the colossal drop-off by Stefano Coletti, because he finished like first, second, and third in the first 8 or 9 races, and then didn't score any points after that. So it's just this colossal drop-off.
Yeah, I remember watching, because I used to watch the GP2 alongside the F1. I remember one race in Monza where I think Sam Bird was a title contender at one point. I remember him and Lima started at the back of the grid for some reason. I think it was in the feature race. And they were trying to make their way through the field, and they just couldn't. They were both like in 12th and 13th and couldn't make their way through the field.
Yeah, it wasn't one of those strong years, because Giorgio Pantano, he went on to win the title 2008. I think he took the GP2 title, but then never made it to Formula One again after that. And now he runs his own karting team back in Italy. Those are the 2. Or is it Davide Valsecchi? He's another champion. We've got 3 GP2 champions that never made it to Formula One. There was another one that did. I mentioned Timo Glock. He won the title in 2007, and then 2008 he signed with Toyota. So people look back at Toyota and kind of laugh at them a bit now because they entered Formula One in 2002. They'd spent the whole of 2001 testing extensively in a car they built just for that. And they pumped in a huge amount of money. I think in 2008 they actually had the biggest budget on the grid, and all it got them across their 7 years in F1 was a couple of pole positions, a couple of podiums, but never a win, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, what's it called? In 2000, they started showing potential towards the end. Like in 2008, 2009, they started getting pole positions and podiums. I think Trulli was especially good in those last years. And then in 2010, they had that car, which I don't know if it's true that that it was going to be one of the best cars on the grid, but I've heard rumors that that was one of that could have easily won the championship, the 2010 Toyota.
It looks good. HRT tried to use it in 2011, but they couldn't afford it. It actually got bought by Pirelli, and they used it for tire testing. Oh, no, wait, no, it didn't. Sorry. The 2009 Toyota was used for tire testing, but yeah, the 2010 one, it's just sat in a museum or in a lobby of a building somewhere in Cologne, I think now. Yeah, it just didn't work with Toyota in the end. And this season they got a couple of podiums. I mean, Trulli very, very experienced. Glock much less so, but he put on a mixture of good performances and a few good crashes to entertain people as well.
What I love about Toyota that season is they were the definition of mid. The two drivers finished 9th and 10th, and Toyota were 5th in the standings. So it matches perfectly, and I'm not too sure it has happened often, where you get a team that finishes in the middle of the pack and the drivers match basically the driver numbers that they should have the next season. And that's what happened. Funnily enough, if you consider the standings, removing all the results of the top three that shall not be named, Trulli actually finishes 3 positions above Glock. So Trulli even leapfrogs Vettel in the standings, which goes to show how Trulli was much better than we think. At least I think that season. But that's his issue, right? All of his seasons, if you go into analytics and if you go into numbers and percentages and all kind of weird underlying stats, you will find that Trulli is a better driver than you saw. But he never delivered on that because his race pace was atrocious, because he would make mistakes. But Trulli at his prime, and again, Ciaron's not here today, and Ciaron is one of the main academics of the school of thought that Trulli was better than Alonso in 2004. Trulli, the thing is, he never keeps his prime for an entire weekend, never mind a season.
I was going to mention 2004 before you did, but he did have more points than Alonso in 2004 when he got fired for letting Barrichello through at the last corner of the French Grand Prix, which is obviously a big no-no for if you're a Renault driver, don't get overtaken at the French Grand Prix. But yeah, Trulli, he was really as you said, he didn't always show his pace over a race weekend. I think he could be similar to Carlos Reutemann in that vein, because obviously Reutemann, there were several examples where he was amazing in qualifying and then would do absolutely awful in a race. I think the biggest example is when he was fighting for the 1981 title, and he qualified on pole position for the last Grand Prix of the season. Could have easily taken the title if he'd have just finished in the top 5, and then he falls back to 5th on the opening lap, and then finishes 7th, and loses the title to Piquet.
It's yeah, looking at Trulli and Glock in 2008. You could see sort of him as you could see Trulli as the sort of neutral good, and I think I'd call Glock the kind of chaotic good, because he was, he got outscored, he got far fewer points finishes, but then he had big crash in Australia, big crash in Germany. I think he crashed again in Japan, and then of course we have the "is that Glock" moment in in at the final round. So he was sort of bringing a lot of excitement, I think, and some people still feel a bit raw about Brazil, and I think he got a lot of hate from Brazilian fans afterwards, even though he'd done nothing wrong essentially. I mean, I suppose even if he had pitted, he probably would have still finished behind Lewis. But yeah, it was just
I think I did see something online. Well, first of all, I think the lap times from Trulli and Glock on that final lap were within a tenth of each other, so there's no way that Glock could have fixed it. And they released a video a couple of years ago of his last lap, and you can literally see he's dancing around the track, and he looks like he's going to bin it at any moment. And I think in general, like, he finished in 6th in that last race, obviously in Interlagos, and finished 2 places ahead of Jarno. So I don't know if Jarno tried the same strategy that he did, but that strategy, as well as he lost to Lewis at the last corner, he might have lost to Lewis in the pit stops anyway.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty certain he was behind. Well, he was behind him before everyone started pitting, because otherwise, because Hamilton was riding in fifth for most of the race, and then it's Vettel passing him that suddenly made the titles taken away from him. Yeah, I mean, it was something that kind of puzzled me a bit, because 2008 was interesting because we had a lot of wet races compared to these days when it seems to almost never rain. And I think someone even made a theory. I think it was around 2019, because the races were either dry or they would hint at rain and the rain wouldn't come, or if it did come, it would be after the race. And people were saying there was even a theory that literally, like, the heat from the tires and the emissions of the exhausts was creating a sort of eye of the storm effect around the circuit that was stopping the rain getting in or whatever. But we got these wet races. The thing is, we still had treaded tires as well, and even the treaded ones were just grooved tires, I should say. And you'd think those would work a little bit in kind of moist conditions, but they just didn't seem to work at all.
Yeah, I mean, there is a similar thing to that in NASCAR. There is a genuine theory, because it's Americans and they're red, and a lot of them are rednecks, even though it's a very cheesy stereotype. And they think that because the cars go round in circles, that does create a storm, and it stops, because there have been so many cases in NASCAR history where rain has been threatened, and then it pours it down after the race is finished.
Yeah, it's definitely an option. It clearly didn't happen so much this year because we had we had rain in. Well, Monaco was wet. Silverstone was soaking the whole time. Then we had rain right at the end of Belgium. Italy was wet the whole weekend. And then Brazil, it rained at the end. And that's a lot for one season. I mean, these days we almost never get wet. We had a lot of, I suppose in 2023, we had a lot of wet qualifyings, but very few wet races other than Zandvoort, I suppose, might have been the only one, actually.
And even then, that one got stopped because it was too wet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously these days I kind of feel like I prefer every race to be dry, because if there's the slightest bit of rain, it's going to be nothing but red flags and safety cars. We're not going to. I mean, we saw this with Japan 2022. They're just not going to let them race properly if it rains. When they used to do that, I mean, when you look at Silverstone 2008, it is insane how wet it was at points. And there's shots of Hamilton just appearing out of the mist. And drivers were spinning off, and there were a few safety cars, I think, but there were no red flags, and they just kept going. And it created an amazing race.
I mean, I can understand why there's so much apprehension nowadays, because they don't want a Bianchi 2.0. And I know people always talk about, well, they let a tractor on track in Japan in 2022, but that was the only reason there was ever nearly a problem with that was because Gasly was driving like a chav and he didn't know how to slow down. But I think that I understand why they're doing it. I'd much rather have. I think everyone in their heart of hearts would much rather have a safe race with 5 red flags than see someone die because they've aquaplaned in wet conditions and something's gone wrong.
Yeah, definitely. It is making. I understand the need to be more cautious because of Bianchi. I think it goes a bit overboard now, particularly now that we have the halo, and that itself has increased safety even more. I mean, there are some accidents like Zhou's, and it's like, okay, it's legitimately helped, but it seems a bit curious to me that we had a 20-year period of no deaths, and then since we've introduced the halo 5 years ago, we've had at least 10 accidents that people are adamant would have been fatal without the halo. And it's like, I don't think that's I don't buy into that. I think that Joe's crash, yes, without the halo, that could have been fatal because the roll bar broke. But with a lot of the other ones, I think they still would have survived without it.
Yeah, that's the case with a lot of them. I don't agree with all of them being that way, but I think it could also be the fact that it might sound stupid, and it's probably something that drivers don't consciously think about. But if you're much more protected than you've ever been, of course you're going to take more risks. There's hit stories from the '60s of people like Jackie Stewart and Jochen Rindt pointing to where they're going to go on the track to tell each other where they're going to overtake each other. You wouldn't get any of that sort of stuff nowadays, not just because it's physically impossible, but because the drivers know that they can send it up the inside of someone or go for a dive bomb at turn one, and they're going to probably 99.999% of the time survive. And that definitely, even if not consciously, subconsciously will have an impact, and that's why we've seen so many death-defying accidents in the past couple of years.
Yeah, it could well play a role, I think. But yeah, Toyota, I mean, I suppose you could say, like, well, obviously, Nav mentioned they were kind of the archetypal mid team in terms of their positions and everything. And I think that makes them perfectly analogous to, say, Alpine. Having two drivers fairly close together, yeah, just right in the middle. I mean, Toyota were fighting more with other people, but yeah, basically the one that right in the middle point of the grid.
Even better comparison with Alpine in the sense that they should really be doing much better. And also, they had a very good livery. Well, now Alpine has run theirs with that pink BWT thing. It used to be great. We talked about the rain and all the rainy races we had in Formula One. It's only the best segue into Toro Rosso and Sebastian Vettel's incredible breakout season. So I'll just let Peter tell me what he thought about that season, because it's hard. It was hard not to become a Vettel fan if you started watching the sport in that season.
So before I watched the Bahrain Grand Prix, I'd never heard of him. I'd watched a handful of races in 2007. The only races I actively remember watching in 2007, I remember Indianapolis, Nürburgring, Fuji, and Brazil. I don't have any recollection of Fuji of him crashing into Webber. I don't remember. I remember Alonso crashing out. But yeah, 2008, because after Bahrain, he crashed at the start of that. And so he'd gone the first three races and not finished them. And he was at the bottom of the standings. And I was like, okay, let's go for this kid because, you know, he's the underdog and everyone loves an underdog. And then he crashes again at the start of Spain. So he went the first four races, retired from them. But then after a few races, you kind of get into it. And this is where I learned again, because Toro Rosso had an interesting relationship. They were the last like customer team that we had, because at the time, the 2008 Toro Rosso, it was the STR3, it was the Red Bull RB4. It was exactly the same car, but it had a 2007 spec Ferrari engine instead of a Renault engine. And this somehow, combined with obviously Vettel's own talents, essentially made it better than Red Bull's, the parent team's car, who had two very experienced drivers in Mark Webber and David Coulthard. But yeah, Vettel, they got that car at Monaco and he finishes fifth with it. And then the points start coming in and it gets more, and he starts getting into Q3 and people start taking notice. And then the win comes in Melbourne, Monza. There was a win in Melbourne in the future, I think. 2011, yes. It's yeah. I mean that weekend was a bit of a strange one because it was wet the whole time and because Ferrari McLaren kind of fell off a bit, but also because they picked a low downforce setup because they thought the race was going to be dry, and so that basically helped. And at Monza, you always need low downforce because it's long straights of slow corners and it's a power circuit. So that gave them essentially, if you consider them to be the same lineage as Minardi, they gave a win for Minardi at home as well. And Ferrari engined, and Toro Rosso was an Italian team. But it was the way that people like Lewis, for example, they would talk about him still in the context of being a rookie or being a younger driver because he was a midfielder, when in a year or two, those two would be fighting against each other at the front, and you wouldn't really see that difference. But yeah, that when I look at Vettel's like non-championship seasons, that and 2015 are the ones I kind of point to kind of show Vettel off, I think. yeah, it was just the second half was just amazing.
Yeah, no, fully agree, and especially as I don't think anyone really expected that from him at all. I'm not sure if you remember his hype going into 2008. I think, yeah, they knew he would be doing well, but no one expected those performances. And then, yeah, Toro Rosso being faster than Red Bull was just insane and comical, really. But especially when Vettel was partnered with Bourdais, I remember people thinking it would be quite tight because Bourdais was coming with this huge hype from the US, 4 Champ Car championships, I think, in a row. And then Vettel just completely dominates him. Now, was it due to Bourdais not adapting well? There's a really good chicane. One of our recurring guests, a really good chicane video on Bourdais' performances in 2008 and 9. But still, whichever excuse you can find, Vettel completely dominated him in that season.
Yeah, I mean, I tried because Bourdais again. I kind of paid a lot of attention to this because I was comparing him to Vettel, even though again I'd never heard of him, but I knew when I read up, okay, 4-time Champ Car champion, that obviously means something. But it was a mixture of just generally being slower, but also a lot of bad luck because there was the odd race when things were good. I mean, he didn't finish the first race, but he managed to get 2 points because there were a lack of finishers. Then Belgium, he was set for a podium until the rain came at the end, and he ended up dropping to 7th behind Vettel. And then, yeah, Monza, he qualified 4th, but stalled on the formation lap, and he had to start the race a lap down, when otherwise he probably could have finished on the podium. So it was a mixture of bad luck, but generally, like he had races where he was finishing 17th and 18th, and it was just absolutely miles off where Vettel was.
Yeah, the standout for Bourdais was that Belgium Grand Prix where he was running P3 in the was it the penultimate lap, and then it just completely fell apart when it started raining. Alonso pitted when he was in P4 and then re-overtook all the drivers in front to finish P4 again, where he was 2 laps before. Vettel was one of the drivers who was overtaken by Alonso when I think he was P6. And Heidfeld, who we mentioned before, had pitted early just before the rain started and ended up finishing second, thanks to the BS that happened with the penalty with Kimi and Lewis. So yeah, Toro Rosso was interesting that season because we saw the rise of a future multiple-time champion and just the disappointment from a guy who had completely decimated the US Champ Car series.
Who kind of came after leaving mid 2009, he got sacked because then everyone thought, okay, maybe bad luck in 2008. But then he got beaten by Buemi, who was a rookie in 2009. And so halfway through, he's dropped. And then he goes back to IndyCar and he does IMSA, I think, as well. And he does endurance racing, but he hasn't had a run like he did in Champ Car since then as well.
I think
he's back to dominating. Well, he's back to not dominate. He did really well in IndyCar for a season or two, which I think he kind of dominated. But then, yeah, now he's back in prototypes, and if you follow that, you know him, but not much else.
I'm just in my. I'm just trying to search up to see what he's done since then in terms of actual proper results. Let me just quickly scroll down to his racing record. He's had a couple. He finished second in the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 2011. That's decent. He did that again in 2009. So in ascending order. Finished first in 2016. And then he's basically been a Le Mans stalwart and an IMSA stalwart, really.
Yeah, and I mean his post F1 IndyCar record, because obviously at this point, well, it was called Indy, or just Karts was what it was called, and then there was Champ Car. They merged together. He's got a couple of wins, but not. Yeah, I mean he stopped IndyCar a couple of years ago, but it's not brilliant. Whereas PK has somehow made, as an example, has sort of worked post F1. I mean, he's done a lot of NASCAR. He won the inaugural season of Formula E somehow. Although the first champion in a new series is often the worst because it's getting into a rhythm or whatever. But for some people it works and others it doesn't. And for him it just didn't. I think as well he probably was struggling to adjust to how to drive a Formula One car compared to IndyCar. The circuits were very different as well. Grooved tires again, which they didn't have in IndyCar. It was similar to Brendan Hartley when he came up to Toro Rosso 10 years later. Is that he was seen using like hypercar and endurance and like Le Mans prototype racing lines, but in a Formula One car, and it was that kind of adjustment that needs to be made.
I think a comparison could be made between Bourdais and Jacques Villeneuve. Jacques Villeneuve, part of his downfall, I'm not sure where the rest of it went, was the fact that he hated groove tyres. He hated moving from slicks to groove tyres, and that's why he fell off in 1998. And you could easily say, even if Bourdais wasn't as vocal about it, that could have easily been one of the reasons why he struggled.
Yeah, definitely. So we'd mentioned before that they that year had ended up beating their parent team Red Bull. Red Bull themselves were obviously, this was not the Red Bull that we know today. I mean, at a glance, it seemed the same in that, you know, they still had Christian Horner as team principal, Adrian Newey, technical director. But Adrian, he joined 2 years earlier. He designed the 07 and 08 cars. Really not his best work, where before he consistently made like race-winning competitive cars. This time, these were just kind of midfielders that were kind of there or thereabouts. They had one of the oldest driver lineups in Coulthard and Webber, who were both in their 30s at this point. Quite a bit of experience. I mean, halfway through the year, Coulthard announces his retirement, and his retirement at the end of the year, and that Vettel is going to come up to race alongside Webber. But between them, I mean, Webber actually started the year very, very strongly because he scored points in 6 of the first 7 races. Coulthard, by contrast, he got a very lucky podium in Canada and scored points in Singapore, 2 very atrocious races, if that's a word, or races of high attrition. But yeah, otherwise, not the best year, and just a year where they unexpectedly got beaten by their junior team.
Maybe it was a thing of ruthless consistency because, like as you said, Webber was ruthlessly consistent for like 5 or 6 races, and then fell off into obscurity-ish by only getting 4 points positions in the rest of the season. And then Coulthard decides that he's only going to get 1 good result and then another mid result, whereas Coulthard, if it wasn't for his podium, would have been behind Bourdais in points, and Webber was absolutely spanked by Vettel. Like, even without the win, they'd be equal on points, Toro Rosso and Red Bull.
I think this is part of the change in performance, is that when Webber's points stop coming in so much, is at the same point that Toro Rosso get their new car. Because I mentioned the SDR3, they run the first 5 or 6 races using a B spec model of their 2007 car, and they bring that in, and that's when Vettel starts getting the points, and that's when Red Bull suddenly stop getting them. Yeah, I mean, there were a handful here and there. I mean, he got 21 points, and Coulthard got 8, 6 of which came from that podium of his. But also that he'd had, I mean, in Australia he got taken out by Massa. And it was funny because afterwards he got interviewed, and he was or something on live TV to Louise Goodman on ITV, and he was like, "Oh well, if Massa comes near me again, then I'll punch 3 colours of shit out of the little bastard." A very different breed of driver back then in terms of how they spoke to the cameras. And again, Webber, the same thing. The year before, Fuji about Vettel, you know, it's kids. Kids are not enough experience. They do a good job and then they fuck it all up. But he took Vettel out, Coulthard did, on the first lap in Silverstone, which I was not very happy about. And then he crashed at the start of Japan with Nakajima, and then crashed again with Nakajima at the start of Brazil. So yeah, it was just kind of going off a bit for him. And I even though I didn't watch much F1 in the Schumacher era, but I knew Coulthard's name because everyone did. But yeah, he was obviously, it was time to end, I think, for him.
And you could say that he had the similar sort of thing to what Raikkonen did in 2021, where there were multiple times where it looked like he'd just fallen asleep at the wheel and just caused an incident because he wasn't paying attention. And there was also the one thing for livery nerds that Coulthard had that Wings for Life livery in Brazil, and obviously and the helmet camera I think he had, but we only got to see it for 2 corners before he got blown up.
I mean, we at least got to see what a crash looks like from the driver's perspective. But yeah, that was a very new. We hadn't really seen, because I think I'm not sure if it was actually behind the visor, but it was helmet cameras were very, very rare at the time, because they'd only started using onboard cameras in the 80s. I mean, in the 60s, Phil Hill did a couple of races where they put a camera on the car to be used for filming for the movie Grand Prix, and he would do those, and he would race for like a lap and then pull into the pits, and they got the footage they need. But yeah, first helmet cam, so that was quite something quite new to get from them. But yeah, not really their best season. But then we saw, obviously, 2009, things changed completely with the new regulations and the sort of diffuser meta, which brought Newey back into his own.
Yeah, the fact Webber completely obliterated Coulthard basically into retirement was a bit shocking. Some have attributed it to Coulthard not really being into the whole sport anymore. Some said it was what made him retire. So I guess if you're a Coulthard fan, you will say one, and if you're not, you'll say the other. Webber that season was a bit unlucky as well, because he could have gotten the win in Singapore. Many people forget he was one of those with Rosberg, I think, who were chasing down Alonso after that dodgy, let's say, dodgy criminal, absolutely illegal strategy. But then Webber got a mechanical issue. So Webber, I think, could have taken that win from Alonso, because there was something I remember. I haven't rewatched the race for obvious reasons. And he was unlucky there. And one thing he definitely was unlucky with is he would have definitely gotten either P2 or P3. So after that season, Webber's like reputation in F1 was quite high. And obviously we know that in 2009, Vettel would be faster. So yeah, Red Bull in 2008, it was a transitional period. And it's mad to think that if they hadn't made the decision of just changing how things work and just going towards youth more than sticking with their old drivers, we might have never seen the domination we saw in the 2010s.
Expand on your point on Coulthard. You said you didn't know if it was a case of him thinking he was past it, or if it was a case of him just wanting to retire. He said, I'm not sure if you've seen it, in the past couple of months, he's started this podcast with Eddie Jordan and a couple of other oldies. And in that, he did say that in his case, you either lose the need or you lose the speed. So you lose either your talent or your want to race in F1. And he said that he lost the need. He said that he lost the want and the desire to compete in Formula One.
I think I remember him being interviewed at the Monaco Grand Prix. I can remember a couple of snippets from the interview, them asking him about if he was considering retirement, and I think he said something along the lines of, well, you're not going to race in Formula One if you don't feel like fully committed, or if you think you can deliver 100%. It was something like that. So I guess by that point he was thinking about it. I mean, by then he would have been 30, 35, 36. So not as old as he could have been. So he theoretically he could have kept going until, well, he could have kept going as long as Webber did, because Webber retired at 36 in 2013. I mean, Coulthard could have done the same, hit 40, had a few wins with Red Bull.
The thing with Coulthard that year is his final race summed it all up. The fact that he had this incredible livery that gets forgotten with all the faces of fans, I think, and engineers and fans on the car, and then he gets involved in the turn one incident. I can attribute the thing at least 50% to him. And I'm like, you have like, what was it, 10,000? Was it 100,000? There were like 15,000 faces on that car. Try to complete a lap, don't get into trouble. But that year he was just always in incidents, and his focus was just down that year.
I've just had a look on his Wikipedia page quickly. He was 37 when the season ended, rather than 34 or 35. But you've also got to think he started, considering he started in the early or the mid 1990s. He started quite young. He started in his early 20s, which by then was like kind of on the younger side because he was like what 23 or 22 would have been when he made his F1 debut if it was early March. And I think he could have easily got burnt out by that point because you got to think he'd been at Williams, a great team, and McLaren, a great team, and then was there to be like what Schumacher was to Mercedes, or what I'm trying to think of other drivers who joined a team in their late career that then went on to become one of the bigger teams.
I mean, I was going to say the analogy would be like someone like Raikkonen going to Alfa Romeo, in that it's like a retirement home, is basically what that would be. Yeah, I mean, that's a 13-year career, which is the equivalent of Checo start 2011 to 2024. So 13 years, but that's somebody who, even though his performances can be found wanting, there's no reason to say, oh, he's getting too old. And obviously Checo's had a lot more races than him. So 13 years is not abnormally long. He could have gone until maybe 2011, 2012 if he wanted, but obviously he just didn't want to, and he ended those last two races with, or two of the last three races involved first lap crashes with Nakajima. And speaking of Nakajima, I think we should talk about Williams. They had, obviously spent most of that decade just in terminal decline, sort of bounced back a little bit in the early 2000s with the BMWs and with Montoya and Ralf Schumacher, but couldn't really take it to Ferrari. Then they start dropping off. 2006 is appalling. It gets better in 2007. Then 2008, it's Rosberg is now in his third year with them. Nakajima has joined them full time, where the previous year Alex Wirtz retired before the last race, and so they brought him in for one race, crashes into his mechanics, and then they're both here together. And yeah, it was Rosberg did massively outperform him, but I remember it just being quite a destructive year because there were a lot of accidents from both drivers.
I mean, Nakajima came in because I think it was because Williams wanted Toyota engines, wasn't it? So, yeah, and I mean, Nakajima, like, people remember him as either A, a kamikaze driver, or B, just really mediocre, like his dad was, like Satori was. But I've actually looked at both of their results. If you take away Rosberg's podiums in Melbourne and in Singapore, if you take those away, I know they are the bulk of his points, but if you take those away, Nakajima doubles Rosberg's points.
Yeah, I mean, it shows obviously that the two races where Rosberg got podiums is that Nakajima also scored points. So those were clearly races that were, I mean, they were both chaotic races where they kept out of trouble, but obviously I think they were also races that just suited their tracks, that suited their car well. I mean, of the two, again, because I was new to F1, Rosberg, I was like, okay, he seems like this relatively promising midfielder. I'd never would have suspected that he would be a champion one day. Never struck me that way. Nakajima, I was supporting him because I was like, okay, well, I like Japanese drivers. Let's see if this one can do well. And even though he was outscored by Rosberg, he scored points. He scored points 5 times, and so did Rosberg. It's just that Rosberg got 2 podiums, so ended up outscoring him. But yeah, there were just a few accidents. And there was also, because as well as we mentioned Coulthard, Brazil, and Japan, there was also Turkey crashes into Fisichella at the start. His front wing broke off in Canada and he crashed in the pit lane, and then lost his front wing again in Silverstone. So there was a lot of front wing breakages going on. Yeah,
I mean, to your Rosberg point, I mean, at the time, yes, he was an upper midfield driver, and you would have never expected him to win a championship. Even in Mercedes, like for the first until Lewis came in, it was as if like he was better than Schumacher, but Schumacher is an anomaly. Like, you can't compare someone to a 40-year-old Schumacher because we don't know if that version of Michael Schumacher was. Well, we know it wasn't as good as his Ferrari Schumacher, but we don't know where to put him on the scale of where he is as a driver. I think Nico Rosberg, for his entire career, was just an upper midfield driver that had a really high performance ceiling, like a Damon Hill. And just so happened, I'm not going to say he looked into his 2016 championship, because I don't think so. I think he won that championship on merit, because he had the same amount of problems as Lewis did that season. But I do think that of the champions, he's the least expected champion of at least the last 30 years. Unless if Eddie Irvine had won it in '99, maybe. But I think that's what I think.
Yeah, because I mean, at the time, I didn't know that Mercedes would come back. My knowledge of the sport in general was a bit primitive. I didn't think, okay, he's going to come back and he's going to fight against Schumacher. I just thought, yeah, he's just a reasonable midfielder, someone of the sort of caliber of Fisichella maybe or Trulli, where things start promising and then just kind of gradually get worse and worse. Is how to describe it. But yeah, I knew that Williams were a big name in their historic team. But yeah, it was just a year of but just a year that wasn't brilliant when they've been in this lull that it seems like they may never get out of, particularly now that Frank is gone. Patrick Head is no longer in the team. Adrian Newey's been gone for obviously the downfall started with him leaving. I don't know if Williams will ever really come back to their former glory.
In 2008, Rosberg had a big issue, which is that after 2007, he was one of the biggest rising stars in the sport. And a lot of people had him as a potential title contender, maybe not F1 champion, but as a proper contender. And then in 2008, with Kubica performing well and Vettel just storming through all the steps that you usually take in Formula One, Rosberg just really fell behind. He didn't really dominate Nakajima the way that he was expected to. I think he only beat Nakajima 14-4 in qualifying, which is good, of course, but Nakajima was seen as very inexperienced joining Formula One. His GP2 season just before hadn't been great at all, and Rosberg had just struggled in 2008 after his initial podium, which was, it was fantastic. And then there was a nice scene with Lewis where they're hugging each other and jumping and being like, we did it, because they had always said they will be on a F1 podium together one day. And it was in the first race of 2008, which was much earlier probably than they expected. But after that, it just really didn't really happen. And even when Rosberg moved to Mercedes, it didn't look like we would ever see Rosberg as a title contender, let alone as a title winner. And Nakajima, again, 2008, he didn't have a bad season at all for a rookie, and most people expected him to be one of the worst drivers on the grid when he wasn't. He just lacked pace. But sixth in Monaco, for example, you don't just finish sixth in what is a lower midfield car by mistake. It was a lucky sixth, but it wasn't completely out of order. So yeah, Nakajima at the end of that season had quite some prospect going into the next few seasons, and it's also why after lackluster 2009, some of the prospective newcomers in 2010 still wanted him as a driver. He went on to have a really good career in endurance racing anyway, but I feel like in Formula One he gets just remembered as the son of another F1 driver who just didn't do much.
Yeah, because his father Satoru, he was a Honda factory driver, and Kazuki deliberately chose to get back in from Toyota to avoid accusations of nepotism. And it's like, well, I think indirectly it must have helped. His dad would have had money, but also connections, and he would have had the Nakajima name that would have helped things. But yeah, it was 2008. It could have been worse. 2009, he didn't score any points at all, and Rosberg scored quite a few. And there were a lot of races where he finished 9th, and like he qualified 5th in Silverstone, but then finished outside the points, so that just didn't work. And then he's dropped at the end of the year, and it's also bye Toyota engines at the same time. But yeah, post F1, I mean, he nearly got a seat with, well, I say nearly, assuming they were ever going to get on the grid. Stefan Grand Prix wanted him. But then he won titles in Super Formula, and he's won Toyota. He's won a lot in WEC, and he's won Le Mans, and now he runs the team. So he's done fairly well for himself post F1.
I think definitely that Kazuki is definitely better than his dad. Satoru was really, if you wanted Honda engines, you bought Satoru Nakajima and you put him in your car, like Lotus did with Senna, like I think Tyrrell did it as well in the late 80s, early 90s. He was basically, if you want Honda engines, put this guy in your car.
Yeah, it seems to be a thing fairly unique to like Japanese drivers, because Takuma Sato again was a Honda driver who, Jordan Honda, then BAR Honda, then Honda, then Super Aguri Honda. So always a Honda guy. Yamaha had connections with Aguri Suzuki, again with his cars. Mugen Honda with Shinji Nakano. And then you've got Ukyo Katayama being sponsored by Mile 7, which is obviously not an engine, but they were his ones that got him seats with Tyrrell and Minardi. And now Yuki, again, is backed by Honda. So Japanese drivers, and then Kamui Kobayashi was a Toyota driver too. So yeah, they always that seems to be the only way to get in as a Japanese driver is to have an engine manufacturer backing you.
You missed Toru Takagi. Was he also a Japanese engine supplier kind of guy?
Well, he did a year with he was Tyrrell, and then it was Arrows, and Arrows 99 Arrows. I think it was.
Was it Yamaha or was it Supertech?
Yamaha.
It was I think it was the Supertech. Minardi in '98 had Ford engines, didn't they?
Yeah, maybe Takagi was not one of those. Maybe it was just the exception to the rule. I mean, there's
like Sakon Yamamoto wasn't connected to any engines, but he had Sanho Human Services big ass sponsor.
There was a couple of others like Toshio Suzuki and Taki Inoue, but they were in for their personal wealth, I think.
Yeah, they only did one or two. Yeah, they were different. They didn't get long-term contracts. Obviously, Yuji Ide did, but that was mostly because Aguri wanted an all-Japanese lineup, and he's like, well, let's pick this guy. Because he finished runner-up in... It was either Formula Nippon or All Japan Formula 3 in 2005, but he'd been racing for 12 years at that point. So yeah, kind of past his prime, assuming he had one.
Well, I think all of this has been the perfect segue to the next team and the next constructor we're looking at, which is Honda. Honda had a bad-ish season, I would say, and it was. The thing is, for such a bad season for a backmarker, they're one of the most remembered teams just because they are what became the 2009 Braun GP with the exact same lineup.
Yeah, this is the sort of Team Brackley, is how you'd put it, that started life as Tyrrell originally, way back in the late 60s. I don't know if they've always been based... I don't think Tyrrell were always based in Brackley, but certainly they were by the 90s, and then it becomes BAR, and then BAR becomes Honda, and then Braun, and then Mercedes, and here we are today. But yeah, with this, going into this, so I knew who Barrichello was because of Ferrari, and I knew who Jenson Button was because everyone who's British knows who Jenson Button is. And I knew that, he finally got his win in 2006, a week after appearing on Top Gear as the star in a reasonably priced car or something like that. He finally gets his first win. Just an appalling season. For me, they were very anonymous for a lot of it because I was like, okay, well, the car's bad. It doesn't even look good. They put the horns on it, but the livery was much, much uglier than what they'd done the year before. A lot of people hate the Earthstreams livery from 07, but I think it's absolutely brilliant.
I hate it.
I love it. It's so different. I mean, it's so asymmetrical as well, and that. Whereas this one doesn't look anywhere near as good. I think it doesn't. It's hard to tell that it's a world map. Whereas the other one with the black and the blue, you can tell it's like the blue marble in space. It just looks. It's really unique. Even if the car was probably worse than this one. I mean, it was 2008. The car was marginally better, but early on, Button he finished 6th in Spain. And then Barrichello got that podium in Silverstone. And at this point, I think they'd said, okay, we're not developing this car anymore. And they were obviously working on the Braun car, which is why when that happened and we got Braun and they start dominating, I wasn't entirely shocked by that because I knew that they'd been working on the car for such a long time. But yeah, 2008 was just basically a throwaway year for Honda.
So looking at some reviews of this season to prepare for today, I found a Bleacher Report review of 2008 where they ranked the drivers and they had Button in 18th and Barrichello in 9th. Now, from what you remember from that season, Peter, would you say that's fair to have Button in 18th and Barrichello in 9th? Because Barrichello was better that year, for sure. But putting him as a top 10 driver that year also seems maybe a bit far-fetched, although usually you don't look at one-offs when you're ranking a driver, but that P3 in Silverstone was one of his best drives, maybe ever. Like I would put him in his top 3 drives ever.
I think that's mostly why, to be honest, because he did score points as well in Monaco and Canada. So he very comfortably outperformed Jensen, but I think ninth is a bit generous because outside of that, it was a very anonymous year where they were just very close to the back. Yeah, I mean, the year before, I think Barrichello had got 1 point maybe, and Button hadn't got any. And then 06, Button did outperform Barrichello, who'd just come over from Ferrari. But yeah, it was just, it was like a throwaway transitional year in the end.
I mean, when it comes to ranking, it's very hard, especially in a sport like F1, to separate the car they're driving, and the actual driver themselves. Especially when you have like such a weird season like 2008, where, like, for example, Barrichello got, 11 points compared to Button's 3. He got 3.5 times the points that Jensen did, but he wasn't 3.5 times the better driver, even with that podium in Silverstone. So I can see why they'd put him up. It depends who they put him above and who they put him below. Like, let's say if they, let's just pick a driver out of nowhere. Let's say if he was better than Trulli. The answer's probably no, because he was miring in obscurity while Trulli was busy getting consistent points finishes for Toyota. But yeah, I can understand why they'd rank him high, because they do want to just not ignore the people at the back and just say, well, they did bad. They did bad because they were in a bad car.
So just so you know, Trulli was put as 6th in that ranking. Webber was put as 8th. Barrichello was put as 9th, and this is where I wish Ciaron was here. Kimi was put as 10th, and I would have loved to see his reaction into knowing that Barrichello with 11 points in 2008 and 1 podium was faster, that was better than Kimi Räikkönen.
Is this from race fans?
No, it's from Bleacher Report, which usually does a good job, but they also do some weird ones sometimes. But they have Kimi as 10th, which is, yeah.
I mean, Kimi's personal performance that year, it wasn't. I think the reason why he didn't do as well was obviously circumstance. And yeah, like, if you look at Kimi's season, I'm pretty sure though, was it this year or 2007 where he got the most fastest laps of anyone?
Yeah, it was insane. In 2008, he got like 9 or 10.
Yeah, so Kimi wasn't, like, don't get me wrong, Kimi wasn't the best driver. He wasn't anywhere near the level of Felipe, at least not for the second half of the season. But he wasn't worse than Barrichello. Barrichello gets one good result and they put him up there. Kimi's always been known for his brutal consistency, at least since his McLaren days. And the fact they put him that low, just kind of, that doesn't sit right with me.
I think those Honda performances were basically just very lucky ones from Barrichello, because outside of his points forming finishes, he finished no better than 11th in any other race and as low as 17th in one of them. I mean, so yeah. I mean, you could say, yeah. I mean, you could say that those performances were because the car was performing where the car was on pace. Because, like, how, even with those results, where did they finished 9th in the constructors, which is only above Force India, who scored nothing, and Super Aguri, who folded after 3 races. So it was obviously a pretty abysmal year. I mean, I would say if you take the podium and finish away, they still finish in the exact same place. But yeah, it was just a dismal year for Honda. It was like, but going back to that livery, because obviously you said you really liked it, the 2008 one was worse. I still think the 2008 one was worse. It's just like they corporatized a livery that wasn't meant to be corporatized, which is very weird. And it was all horrible and in white and green. It didn't work. I think the globe was upside down as well, so you could sort of make out like the Arabian Peninsula. I can't really tell what's where on it too.
There are 2 hilarious paragraphs in one of the reviews I saw on Jensen Button. So they typoed 2008 to 2009, and it's Jensen Button won't look back at 2009 with many happy memories, but he should have performed a bit better than he did, along with putting more effort in. So that's the first paragraph that didn't age well because of one typo. And secondly, now that Honda has left F1, Button may end up with no seat for after 2009. Life can't get much worse for the British driver. If he ends up having to seek a seat from another team, his 2008 form won't be a strong selling point. And unless someone takes over the Honda team, his future in F1 looks pretty bleak. I do not see him staying in F1 for the 2010s decade. So that was fantastic to read.
I mean, saying that an F1 driver should put in more effort is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. But yes, so this driver who's in the job of his life, potentially, and the top career motorsport is just going to go, yeah, I don't really. I mean, Kimi does that, but that's because it's Kimi. Like saying that that the driver
He
should put
actually
in more
puts in a
effort.
lot of effort.
Yeah, exactly.
And Kimi actually puts in a lot of effort. It's just PR where he doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then it's saying that what was it that they said about Jensen's actual season? Was it again? Can you just read it out for me again, please?
So Jensen won't look back at 2008 with many happy memories, but should have performed better, along with putting more effort in. And basically, they thought, from what I've read, that Barrichello, he didn't have a contract for 2009, as we saw, as you guys might have seen in the Braun GP documentary. So he really had to work for it. But because Button had a contract, a lot of reviews said that Button didn't care much about 2009.
I mean, the principle sounds fair-ish, but in practice, like, no. Like, I think Button's seat was only confirmed 3 weeks before the season when Braun eventually said, "Oh yeah, we're going to be able to do this," and then Barrichello came in. That's a very harsh. Isn't Bleacher Report American?
Yes.
I mean, that explains a lot. Americans covering motorsport in the late 2000s, they probably got the combined knowledge of Paul di Resta and Anthony Davidson, but yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I don't entirely disagree with that, Freudian slip about 2009, because I would almost argue that 2009 was Button at his worst, because in the races he did win, he led from the front, and then after his 6th win from the first 7 races, he didn't win any more. There were a few podiums, but he made it very hard for himself in a year where Vettel made a colossal amount of mistakes, and Ferrari and McLaren were good in the second half, but had started so badly in the first half they didn't have time to catch up. But he put in 2010, 11, 12. That was when he did put in some really good performances. And even earlier on, he'd had a really good year. 2004 with BAR, 2006 with Honda was a good year. So yeah, 2009. In terms of his driving, it doesn't really stand out. It's just the car was so good.
I have to disagree, because I'd completely agree with you if it wasn't Rubens Barrichello in the other car. And he got those 6 wins, and that was basically all he needed to take it through to the end. And I mean, Barrichello did perform better in the second half of the season, I'll grant you that. But I mean, Barrichello had a tendency to do that, and for some reason, apart from against Schumacher, he would always do better than his teammates in the second half of the season. It seemed it was quite weird in that form, and I do think Jensen's title was, because although he was a bit slow in some races, there were a couple of races in mid-season where I think he either failed to score points or was very low in the points, even when the car, although it had fallen down the order, obviously, it had fallen from definite top to at least like 4th or 5th quickest car by the end of the season. I do think that Jensen mostly held his ground.
It was really mostly damage control, because he'd built such a huge lead, which was helped by Vettel losing loads of points in the first couple of races. But yeah, while Barrichello is like stronger in the second half, Button is someone who starts strong and gets weaker, because we saw this in 2010, 11, and 12 again, of starting strong and getting weaker. But the 6 races he won, I think all of them were won off the front row. And then after that, there were races like Silverstone and Hungary where he just didn't have the pace. And then he was involved in a first lap crash in Belgium. And a lot of the rest of it was just damage limitation, really.
I mean, yeah. I don't know where that Braun was on performance in the second half of the season. I think it's impossible to really tell because of the way in which it was so much different from the start of the season. I don't know if they were 3rd quickest, 4th quickest, 5th quickest, 6th quickest, and they just had 2 good drivers hauling that thing into the points. But yeah, it was an interesting year from Braun and from Honda in 2008. Obviously, had a bit of an abysmal season turn into a championship winning season the year after.
I'm not one to plug F1 shows, especially with stuff like Drive to Survive being thrown around, even though my channel mostly gets views from Drive to Survive compilations. But that Braun GP Disney Plus documentary is really worth it, and I would recommend it to anyone into F1, because it's actually on what happened, especially the first episode. I would say the first episode is to be watched by any Formula One fan anyway, because as much as so it's The fourth episode is one of the most useless 40 minutes I've ever spent, because they realized the first episode is how did Honda become Braun, and then second episode is Braun wins everything. Third episode is Braun is losing everything, and then fourth episode is okay. So how do we make this look like a comeback? But the thing is that fourth episode is only covering 2 races, and those 2 races, you can't have 45 minutes on 2 races, because the first episode had been like 55 minutes, because it's a whole legal issue from Honda to Braun. Where do they get sponsors? Who are they going to sign? How are they going to make the car work? The car's not turning up to testing. And then the last episode is just on trying to win. So they make the Brazilian Grand Prix last 20 minutes, and they repeat at least 5 times Button will be starting from 14th. This is very hard to get a podium from. Button will be starting from the 7th row. How is he going to finish on the podium? Button is starting not in the top 10, and they sit in every single way you can ever imagine to make it dramatic.
He
But
spent
other than
half the
that,
race stuck behind Kobayashi, who was a rookie as well.
Exactly, that's the thing. Yeah. And they do cover it, but because that episode is meant to be, they win in the end, they are like, yeah, Kobayashi was good. Anyway, Button still got the title. So yeah, the first episode is really good because it really shows how Honda was really, really struggling, but also they did the respectful thing of making sure that the team wouldn't die out, which they easily could have done.
I mean, to be fair, I'm usually very pessimistic with those sort of especially modern shows about F1, because they're usually all trying to leech off the fame and trying to leech off the hype, and don't do it justice. I only watched the first couple of episodes of Braun, not because I didn't like it. I actually did really like it, but I just got bored. I do this thing where I get bored of a series, even if it's really good. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a thing of TV in general nowadays, because I think for example, when F1 made Rush, when they made previous F1 films, it was for a specialist audience. It was for people who watch Formula One and people who were interested in Formula One. They were interested in a battle from 40 years ago. Whereas nowadays, the climate's completely changed. So I'm surprised. Well, obviously, Braun is modern history, so maybe I'm less surprised. If they were to do like a thing on Wolf, which was another Braun-esque team, although it wasn't a reviving of an old team, it was a new name that had come to the forefront of sport. That maybe it didn't win a championship, but it won a couple of races. That wouldn't do well nowadays, because no one wants to know about a team from 40 years ago, but they don't mind it about a team that they might have heard of in passing, because it's such a cliche at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't watched the documentary yet. I probably should get round to it. But 2009 is just a very, very strange season. It was obviously for me, I was a big Vettel fan, and so it wasn't good for me. But it was the cars were ugly, the rules were kind of transitional as well, and the grid was hardly different from the year before. It was just a very, very strange season in general.
What I really respect is Disney Plus had the second episode really map out the FIA versus FOTA dispute, which you wouldn't expect on a Disney Plus basically, on a Disney Plus show, that you would have expected to have simplified it into, look at how this team became a successful one. But no, they fully mapped out the legal dispute, suing Braun. It was, that's why I would recommend it.
But the one thing I didn't like, but I do remember watching about it now, and I brought it up, is the fact I remember they tried to make out like Red Bull and Braun were at war with each other personally, and yes, they might have been at war. Like they might have been like, Red Bull doing classic F1 team things, going, if we can't make something as good as everyone else, we'll ban it or try and get it banned. But the fact that they tried to make it into some sort of personal war between Christian Horner and Ross Braun, that just didn't sit right with me.
That's the thing with most shows, right? It's that because you try to appeal to a wider audience, you want your protagonist and you want your antagonist. So it was the same for me and Ford versus Ferrari, which is now one of my favorite movies. They made Bandini look like a bad guy against Ken Miles and all the others. Bandini was one of the classiest drivers of the 60s, and they still name they have a trophy named the Lorenzo Bandini Trophy to the best. Is it rookie or something? Like he was a really loved driver, but they make him look like this snarky Italian villain in the movie just because they have to.
I mean, I haven't watched Ford versus Ferrari or any of those old ones. Probably again, I probably should, just like Peter said, you should watch the Disney Plus one. But yeah, I will watch that at some point. I only know Bandini from his F1 results. Obviously, he got that one win at Zeltweg, which is, in my opinion, the worst circuit in F1 history. But it doesn't take anything away from Bandini. But yeah, he was a very well-liked driver. There's a couple of trophies that were named after historical drivers, like you got the Lorenzo Bandini Trophy, the Jim Clark Trophy for the naturally aspirated teams in the late 80s, and a couple of others.
Because I knew about that award for a long time, because I think Vettel won it in 2008, Lorenzo Bandini. I didn't know who he was, never heard of him, but obviously he got the acclaim to take that award. But to bring it back to 2008, obviously Honda, we mentioned that there is that podium and they got a few points finishes, but most of the season they spent fighting against Force India, who were a new team in the sense that Force India was new, even though the team itself went back to 1991 when it started life as Jordan, and then Jordan became MF1, and then MF1 became Spiker MF1, and then Spiker MF1 became Spiker, and then Spiker became Force India. So there was a lot of transitions. But yeah, I quickly picked up, okay, this is the slow team, especially after Super Aguri left, and no points all year. Most of it was just a sympathy thing for Adrian Sutil for that fourth place that wasn't to be in Monaco. And Fisichella just, yeah, kind of past his prime, basically.
The thing, Fisichella had already raced with a previous iteration of Force India twice as Jordan. So he seemed more at home and he knew most of the engineers and he performed well generally. Small tangent, because that's just me being curious. Peter, what do you know about Midland and Spiker? Because I just know them as this transition to Force India, so from a big name to another big name. But were they anything worth remembering?
So basically, end of 2004, Eddie Jordan sold Jordan. It was Colin Collers that bought it, or he became the team principal. So they reigned as Jordan for a year. Then he sold. Then it was bought by a Russian consortium. Alexander Schrader, I think was the name. He was this guy. The Midland Group was a company based in Guernsey. They bought it, but it was a Russian company, and they had a Russian license. They just didn't. It was a very, very anonymous year in 2006 because it's like, okay, we're slow, but at least we're faster than Super Aguri. And then they sold the team to Spiker, who bought it for 114 million pounds a few races before the end of the season. And then Spiker are running it for a year, and things are no different except that they have that one moment in the spotlight, obviously with Marcus Winkelhock leading in the Nürburgring, but they didn't. It just did. Yeah, it was just. I don't know. I think it was lack of money, but just lack of expertise. It just didn't. I mean, Colin Collers is not a lot of people's favorite team principal. I mean, he ran HRT as well for 2 years, so he ran like 5 different teams, but none of them did well at all, really. And then Vijay Mallya buys and it becomes Force India. It was quite a chaotic period.
I mean, my words English. My university lecturer, when I was doing my motorsport technology course, he works at BAR back in the day, and he worked for a couple of other teams. And he said that whenever Colin Collers came up, which for whatever reason, because we were talking about car design, whenever he came up for any reason, he was like, anything that Colin Collers does, don't trust it. Apparently, he was quite shady and not the nicest of people.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't really look like a team principal when you look at him. He looks like a builder, to be honest, or like a plumber. But he just, yeah, he just, yeah, he's a bit rotund, bald guy. Just, yeah. But he just wasn't brilliant to have run effectively. Well, Jordan, Spiker, Midland, and HRT. So team principal of 4 different teams. Then he had his own team in Formula 3 as well.
By Collins Racing.
Yeah, not brilliant. I mean, another thing as well is that when Force India bought it, obviously Vijay Mallya had a lot of money. It was running Kingfisher Airlines. They actually used the Spiker car in 2008, so they were running the same car again. And so it's hardly surprising that a car that was already uncompetitive remained being uncompetitive. And they kept on Adrian Sutil, who had spent in 2007. He scored 1 point for them, and somebody again who was a close friend of Lewis, raced alongside Lewis, didn't have the success of the opportunities that Lewis did. 2008, I remember people rooted for him because he was like the young, the young underdog rookie, and he nearly got that fourth place in Monaco. No other points came their way that year. 2009, again, loads of opportunities for him to score points that he kept messing them up. But then after that, he did eventually get them with Force India, but then he just disappeared into obscurity and doesn't spends more time crashing expensive supercars than racing these days.
Yeah, I fully agree. But the 2008 Monaco Grand Prix race could have been one of the most incredible back marker drives ever. He was fourth on pure pace because he just kept it together and kept going when the others didn't. And that was a rare actual mistake that I know Ciaron would actually agree with me, where Kimi just sent him flying. It's just unfortunate because Sutil gets fourth in that race, and we remember him in a different view. And it's as simple as that. And then if something happens later on, Sutil might even get P3 in Monaco, but that he never got the chance. Fisichella was taken by Force India, and I think that was a very good choice by them because he was known to be good with backmarkers and always wrestle out a few points or even podiums in cars that didn't deserve it, or even wins in the case of Jordan. But the car just was slow, let's be honest. And as you said, they just used the spiker from the previous year. They had a very good business plan for 2009, which was let's make a car that goes fast, and it's going to be fast in the fast circuits, which it was. But in 2008, they were just there with a nice livery, with two likable drivers who couldn't do much at all.
I mean, Sutil, I think the Peter kind of underplayed Sutil's kind of not excellence in 2009, but he was, because he got fourth in Monza that one time. Or was it? Did he qualify fourth, or did he finish fourth in Monza?
I think he qualified third and he finished fourth.
Okay. Like so, I mean, they did improve in 2009, especially towards the end of the season, where you get all the fast tracks, your Spas, your Monzas, I don't know if they got any other good results elsewhere. I don't think they did, because there wasn't really any high speed circuit. That's the problem. There's about 4 high speed circuits on the calendar, and especially nowadays with all the street circuits, about 85,000 high downforce tracks rather than low downforce. But yeah, I think Sutil was good. Fisichella was good. They were good drivers. There were 2 upper midfield drivers. Like if you were to see, like, for example, I know the race does driver rankings where they rank both drivers in a team. They rank the teammate pairings. If we were doing a video on that for these lot, they wouldn't be last in the constructors, if you get what I mean. So yeah, I think Sutil and Fisichella were a good pairing, but they just had a car that wasn't going to be able to put them up to those high levels.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously their first season, still just trying to get into it, again, held back by using an old car, because they had that Ferrari deal, and then 2009 they got the Mercedes deal, which they kept they've kept that ever. Yeah, they have kept that ever since, because they're Aston Martin now, of course, aren't they? I was trying to think, Force India, Racing Point? Yeah. No, they've been Mercedes ever since. Yeah, a new team that had just been through a bit of an identity crisis over the previous few years. But yeah, it was a shame that there were a few opportunities for points that just never came about. But still, things could have been worse, and they were worse if your name was Super Aguri. They were a funny one because they're one of the last teams that never made their own cars, because they entered in 2006 as effectively a Honda B team and also just an excuse to keep Takuma Sato on the grid. So the SA05, that was the Arrows A23 just with a new engine. The SA06 that came in halfway through the year was a modified version of that car. The SA07 was the Honda RA106 that Jenson Button won his race in. So that is the one that Sato scored points in and also famously overtook Alonso in Canada. But then 2008, they end up with the Honda RA107, which is the aforementioned Earth Dreams car that got 1 point. So it's not exactly surprising it didn't work in, the 4 races they did, because they were in a bit of a financial crisis already before the season even began.
Yeah, I know that we will soon be covering the Super Aguri debacle anyway in more detail, but just succinctly, they were atrocious in 2008, and I think they got unlucky because they had a deal with Honda to always get the previous year's car, and well, if the previous year's car is atrocious, then what can you really do? Even with the tumultuous races at the start of the season, the best finish was 13th. So that's just they were always going to fold in 2009.
I mean, one thing I have seen, because obviously they used Honda's old cars. Why didn't they just do what Red Bull and Toro Rosso did, which was use the same cars concurrently? Surely that'd be if Honda really wanted to have a B team, surely that'd be the common sense thing to do.
They would have needed to have employed whoever Honda's technical director was to a third party, because that was how Red Bull got around it. Because 2007, several teams did protest at the Toro Rosso because they could see it was the same car. But the reason it was allowed, again, this is another way that Newey has exploited loopholes, is that he was employed by Red Bull Technologies, not Red Bull Racing. So as far as they were concerned, Red Bull Racing had not designed either car. And both teams had basically bought the car off Red Bull Technologies. Obviously, they got rid of that because now you're not allowed to do customer things, or you must make the car yourself, and that's been the case since 2010. Super Aguri would have needed to find someone else to pretend to build the car for them.
So with Red Bull, it was as if it was another chassis design, like if it was Delara or some other chassis designer.
It was as if it was like that they bought. A third party had built the car, even though it was Red Bull, but they just changed who he was employed by. To get Honda and Super Aguri, I don't know what. I was going to say Toyota, but obviously that's not going to happen. Some kind of Japanese company, I don't know, Samsung, Panasonic. They're sponsoring Toyota, but something like that. Nintendo.
Samsung's Korean. Nintendo's.
Yeah, no,
Samsung's
just get
Korean.
them. Just pretend that I can't remember who their technical director was. If he just, he's employed by Nintendo and they've built the car. And they bought it.
Sony is the obvious one. They make Gran Turismo, so I guess.
Sony, or even I don't know, Hello Kitty or Studio Ghibli, just something Japanese.
Sanho Human Services, get Sako Yamamoto.
Yes, yeah. So that was why they couldn't really do that. And I mean, they were perpetually short of money. I mean, they had a few, like their sponsors. They had Honda, but also like SS United, Samantha Kings. I'm guessing that Davidson brought some of those because obviously Sato was just backed by Honda. His whole career he drove for Honda backed cars, and they built the team. I knew who he was because when I was watching races as a kid, I remember watching the US Grand Prix 07. I remember him spinning off because they caught that on camera. I knew the name. I always saw T Sato appearing on the timings whenever I was watching in the Schumacher years. But Davidson just kind of existed. There was a documentary in 2008, it was done in 2007 called Life Behind Lewis, and it showed basically his 2007 campaign and compared how, for example, Hamilton would go to races on a private jet, whereas Davidson had to drive himself and stuff like that. But yeah, he just existed, and they ran out of money after a few races. Yeah.
I mean, going back to Davidson, he was a bit of a nothing driver. The only thing in terms of good results, he was running third, wasn't he, in that Canada race that Sato got sixth in, and then he hit a groundhog or something like that, and lost a chance.
He pitted immediately, and the team didn't notice, so he then had a really, really slow pit stop. He was obsessed with finishing 14th in 2007. But he didn't get so lucky. A lot of races he would qualify well because there were some where both of them would make it to Q3. But yeah, Sato, he only scored points twice. To be fair, it was in Spain and Canada because they did start drifting backwards as the year went on. But yeah, even when I did a 3-part series a few years back on Super Aguri when I used to do with them in like excruciating detail with every pit stop and every overtake. The 2008 video is only 15 minutes long because there were only 4 races to cover, and there were 4 races where very little happened as well.
Yeah. Did they ever overtake anyone in 2008?
I think he must have. I'm trying to think. So in the first race, he was caught up in the pile up at the beginning. Sato, I think they just had an engine failure later on in the race, but he'd been running at the back. I'm pretty certain they both finished in Malaysia, but they were last. In Bahrain, I think Davidson got taken out at the start, and Sato
they finished last.
They finished last, and then Spain, I think Sato finished it, but Davidson, a piece of gravel hit his radiator and broke it. And for some reason, the car had a different livery for that one race. It went from red to white, and I don't entirely, maybe because they lost all their sponsors, I don't know, but the thing is, I remember they turned up at Turkey for that race, but they were turned away at the gates because I think Nick Fry, who was running Honda, said no, you're not allowed to race because they ran out of money. And so they wanted to keep going, but he was like, no, we're not funding this anymore. And so that was when they went into administration. But yeah, I do wish it would have been nice just in the interest of symmetry, if they'd seen out the season, because we would have had our first year with unchanged teams and drivers all year. They wouldn't have scored any points, but it would have been nice just to see it out, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just wary of. I know that we are going to cover Super Aguri in more detail, so making sure we don't just spoil everything for the rest. Because we've gone through all the teams, I just wanted to ask you two, well, Peter and Nedzo in order, what do you think was the race of the season? And Singapore is not a valid answer because everyone thought of it while I asked.
I'd go Brazil. That was one of the best title fights in history. I think even those who don't necessarily like the outcome can accept that was one of the greatest title fights in history. It was definitely because not just it was as a race, the climax and everything. If that was just a normal race, it would also be very exciting. Admittedly, that Glock moment wouldn't have happened because it'd be someone's overtaken someone for 5th place. What a big deal! But I do think Brazil is definitely a big contender for that.
I mean, for me, I guess it depends what you're looking for, because if you're maybe someone who's used to watching NASCAR and you just want mindless destruction, then Australia is probably a good shout. Brazil, yeah, obviously it has the tension of, I mean, most of the race was fairly uneventful, but it was tense because you knew how marginal it was, and then the rain comes at the end. I was having conflicting feelings when Vettel overtook Hamilton, because it's like, okay, Vettel's overtaken Hamilton, but now Hamilton's going to lose the title. And then everybody wins at the end because they both pass Glock. Belgium again, amazing last couple of laps, even if it was, very controversial. The other two standout races, well, these are all wet races. Monaco had some good stuff going on, but really Silverstone was the best one. I think I tried to watch it again immediately afterwards because it was just it was so, I'd never seen such a wet race, and people were spinning immediately. Hamilton puts on the best drive of his career. There was loads going on, and it was my first British Grand Prix as well to watch.
Special mention to Japan as well, because there was a lot going on there, because both McLaren and Ferrari had dropped down the order, especially because at the start Massa, Kimi and Lewis basically wiped themselves out, and then there's a through goes Kubica and Alonso moment, like Ocon in Hungary 21, where they just take the inside line and then they're running in first and second. But yeah, there were so many good races in 2008, and I think it's one of the best seasons for someone to get into Formula One, because you have those champions who, like the previous champion Kimi, who's not doing well, but then you learn about why that was the case. You get Massa, who wasn't that highly rated, but then he starts to come into the fray. Lewis, extremely young, involved as well. Kubica, Alonso. It is biased as well because it was my first proper season, but I just think it had everything really. It had Vettel winning out of nowhere in a back marker. So yeah.
I mean, we also missed Monza. We completely missed talking about Monza in that kind of greatest races. I mean, it was up there, but it was also kind of, I've watched it a couple of times since, but it wasn't really much apart from Vettel's winning in a Toro Rosso.
Yeah, Monza, the race itself was very uneventful. It's just because the order was back to front and because we could see Vettel's win was coming. I mean, I remember in the weekend, almost no laps were set in practice, and then we had that back to front qualifying in the race. I mean, these days people share it because you'll see those compilations where it shows the last lap focusing on Vettel, and they superimpose in Matthew McConaughey in Interstellar when he's watching all the videotapes from his family sent over the past 20 years and starts crying and that. But the race itself was not that entertaining, is the thing. I mean, me and Kyron said this in the last two episodes. The thing about 2008 is that even though Hamilton and Massa were very, very scrappy and made things very difficult for themselves, and there were a lot of controversies involving Kimi and Spa and everything else, it made it one of the best seasons on record and one that everyone remembers. Like, sometimes you don't need F1 to just be clean and proper and always obeying the rules. See 2021. Yeah.
Ooh. That's gonna ruffle some feathers.
I think that may bring this one to a close. It's always a good fun 2008, isn't it? Always a good one. I can remember it like the back of my hand, even though it was 16 years ago.
I can't. Maybe we do a 2012 episode at some point. That'll be good for me.
Yeah.
2012 was the second 2008 to me because just so much fun. Really, it was just fun watching Formula One. Whereas 2023, second half of the season, I would watch the races as a chore, kind of. I had to watch this because I am an F1 fan, so I have to follow.
I mean, there were loads of good seasons in that time. There was 2007, 08, 2010, 2012. There was in the space of 5 years. There was loads of good seasons.
Yeah, the V8 era is my nostalgia era because again around that period 08 to 012 mainly
012
was when me and all my 012 2012 was when me and my friends, we were all like GCSE day levels, we were all really into F1. I went to the British Grand Prix 2011 2012 and then by the hybrid era the cars looked and sounded like dog shit and the races weren't very good and everyone was off at uni and stopped watching it and now we're just in the era of social media cringe, and again, the cars don't look or sound like F1 cars, and they can't overtake each other, and it's not the same as what it was, back in the day. But I think that draws this episode to a close. So thank you to Nav, and thank you to Nedzo for joining us once again. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.